Welcome to the show. This is Liberty. Thank you for listening. I do appreciate it. Today we are going to examine Ibogaine. This will be the third episode in the series Science and Psychedelics. Previously we took a look at psilocybin and ayahuasca. Ibogaine is a naturally occurring psychedelic. It is from the Iboga plant in Africa, and it is considered an addiction interrupter. In 1962, Howard Lotzoff, who was a heroin addict at the time, was experimenting with psychedelics, and he got a dose from a chemist friend of his. He had no idea at the time that it was an addiction interrupter. He just took it, and 24 hours later, he found that he was no longer addicted to heroin, and he became an outspoken advocate of the drug ever since then. I'm going to read some information now from a few different websites, and I'll also link them in the description of the archive of this show that we put on YouTube. The first website is maps.org, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. We'll also be reading from ibogaine.co.uk, which has extensive information, and I'm pretty sure that that is the website for Mr. Lotzoff. We'll also be reading from ibogaine.desk.nl, which the name of that website is the Ibogaine Dossier, and they've got some extensive information on there. First off, I am going to read some information from the Wikipedia article on Ibogaine. And this section is called Treatment for Various Addictions. The most studied therapeutic effect of Ibogaine is the reduction or elimination of addiction to opioids. An integral effect is the alleviation of symptoms of opioid withdrawal. Research also suggests that Ibogaine may be useful in treating dependence on other substances such as alcohol, methamphetamines, and nicotine, and may affect compulsive behavioral patterns not involving substance abuse or chemical dependence. Researchers note that there remains a need for systematic investigation in a conventional clinic research setting. Many users of Ibogaine report experiencing visual phenomena during a waking dream state, such as instructive replays of life events that led to their addiction, while others report therapeutic shamanic visions that help them conquer the fears and negative emotions that might drive their addiction. It is proposed that intensive counseling, therapy, and aftercare during the interruptive period following treatment is of significant value. And that's probably the most important. This is taking a break from the article. That's probably one of the most important things to keep in mind when we're talking about Ibogaine. That this isn't necessarily a cure by any stretch of the imagination. There's lots of things that are involved in drug addiction, the environment that can trigger relapses. There are people that can influence you to relapse. There's all kinds of different things to take into account when dealing with breaking an addiction. So I'd say probably the most effective use of Ibogaine is is the addiction interruption, which is the withdrawal symptoms being stopped, and the physical withdrawal symptoms are probably the toughest hurdle to get over when trying to quit something like heroin or methamphetamines or cocaine. So with those alleviated, it's the next step, of course, is some type of psychological treatment, some type of long-term care, and unfortunately, that's rather difficult to partner with the Ibogaine treatment since it's illegal in the United States and is really only available in the places where it's not banned. And on the North American continents, that's in Canada, Mexico, or actually in Costa Rica. So it's not a quick fix. It's not take a single dose of Ibogaine and you're ready to hit the road running. It should be coupled with psychological treatment and long-term care to help break the habits that also go along with the addiction. It also needs to be mentioned that this is a little more toxic than some of the other substances that we've discussed. Statistically, they say that 1 person in 300 that take Ibogaine could potentially die from it. While it is important to keep that in mind, we're also dealing with a much stronger subject here, with that being drug addiction. Many times people have gone through various types of Western treatment that have been ineffective. They've tried various pharmaceutical drugs that are supposed to curb the habit and the cravings, and they've been ineffective. And sometimes there's people are suicidal, and they're not sure if they don't die from the drugs, if they'll commit suicide. So it is an extreme risk, but you're also dealing with very extreme circumstances. Continuing with the article. Some individuals require a second or third treatment session with Ibogaine over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. A minority of individuals relapse completely into opiate addiction within days or weeks. A comprehensive article on the subject of Ibogaine therapy dealing with the procedure, effects, and after effects is found in Ibogaine in the Treatment Center of Chemical Dependence Disorders, Clinical Perspectives, and there'll be a link to that in the article. Ibogaine has also been reported in multiple small study cohorts to reduce cravings of methamphetamines. So this is very valuable in the treatment of various forms of addiction, and in the maps.org page for Ibogaine, they've listed a history of the different studies and different information, and they have a multitude of articles explaining the value of the treatment that have been written about in all sorts of different websites and papers, and they've got information on different studies that have been done and that they're preparing for in the future. So while this does have a very strong physiological effect of alleviating the withdrawal symptoms and effectively interrupting the addiction, it does have some psychoactive effects, and I'll continue with the Wikipedia article. Ibogaine is a psychedelic. The experience of Ibogaine is broken down into 2 phases. The visionary phase comes first, then the introspective phase. The visionary phase has been described as oneirogenic and lasts for 4 to 6 hours. The second phase, the introspection phase, is responsible for the psychotherapeutic effects of Ibogaine. It can allow people to conquer their fears and negative emotions. Ibogaine has been referred to as an oneirogenic, referring to the dreamlike nature of its psychedelic effect. Ibogaine catalyzes an altered state of consciousness reminiscent of dreaming while fully conscious and aware, so that memories, life experiences, and issues of trauma can be processed. So very often reported are visionary states of awake dreaming. And now I'll move to the ibogaine.desk.nl website, where they talk a little bit about that in a section called Visualizations. One of Ibogaine's principal effects during its first phase of action is to produce a state which emulates dreaming, aside from the fact that the subject is fully awake and has the ability to respond to the treatment staff's questions. In most cases, people under the influence of a therapeutic dose of Ibogaine do not wish to speak. They prefer instead to pay close attention to the visual presentation of memories or phenomena they are experiencing that have been noted to have been both Freudian and Jungian connotations. The experiencing of visual material is rapid. Some patients have described it as a movie running at high speed, others as a slideshow, each slide containing a motion picture of a specific event or circumstance in the viewer's life. In either case, the presentation of visual material is so compressed and fast-moving that distracting the patient for even a moment may interfere with the process. Therefore, in treatment, the intrusion of the medical staff should be kept to a minimum during Ibogaine's primary phase. So the first 4 to 6 hours of the experience are basically a person getting a visual representation of the various experiences in their lives. And the second portion, the second phase of the experience is a cognitive evaluation, and continue to read from the article. The second phase of Ibogaine's action is one of the patient's intellectual evaluation of their previous experiences and decisions. This often occurs after the visualization phase, which generally ends abruptly in 3 to 5 hours. However, individual reactions and variations are the norm and not the exception within the parameters of the procedure. Regarding this process of evaluation by the patient, in many cases, when various decisions were made by the patient in the past, those decisions appeared to be the only options available at the time. However, due to Ibogaine's ability to allow the reevaluation of one's lives, actions, and behavior, it is possible for the patient to understand that alternatives to their original decisions were available, and this knowledge appears to allow the patient to modify their current behavior and cease their drug dependence. So the first half is kind of flashing back through the different experiences that led them to the spot in their life that they are now, being addicted to whatever drug it is that they're addicted to. And then the second phase of the procedure allows them to intellectually go back over the information that they were shown and reevaluate the decisions that they made. And obviously, like it just said, they felt like they were the only decisions that could be made. But with an objective overview, while they're under the influence of Ibogaine, they are able to see that there were actually other choices that they could make. And this is going to help them in the future, to some degree, not make those same bad decisions. There's also long-term effects that occur after the procedure, and of course this goes back to suggesting that there should be psychological support for the patient after the initial treatment. There's a lot of different things that are involved in addiction. Like I said earlier, there's the environment that they're in, the different stresses that are associated with living. There's the people that they're associated with, their friends, can often influence them to start using drugs again. There might be family that doubts the efficacy of the treatment that could possibly trigger them to start using drugs again. So long-term care and psychological help is really important when dealing with an addiction, with stopping an addiction. So the long-term effects, continuing with the article on ibogaine.desk.nl, it has some examples of the long-term effects that were observed in some of the patients that pursued this treatment, and I'll read from that now. Long-term are those which may be noticed from 1 to 24 months after treatment, and in some cases even longer. I have provided 3 examples. Example 1. A heroin-dependent couple were treated. The woman of 26 was a relatively new addict of 3 months, while her 27-year-old husband had a history of over 10 years of heroin use. At the time of their treatment, a protocol of treating one patient at a time was followed. These were early treatments, and the medical support staff were familiarizing themselves with what might be expected during such episodes. Portions of the treatment episodes were observed by Dr. Carlo Cantoreggi, Deputy Medical Director of the Addiction Research Center of the National Institute on Drug Abuse in Baltimore, and Dr. Lester Grispoon of the Harvard Medical School. The husband was treated first, and his wife was completely cooperative and helpful during his treatment. The following day, when the wife was administered her dose of Ibogaine, her husband demanded that he be allowed to leave his room and remain in bed with her. He informed the medical and paramedical staff present that unless he got his way, he would create a disturbance to interfere with his wife's treatment. Rather than deal with a belligerent and angry patient, they decided it would be less harmful to let him have his way. He continuously disturbed his wife during her treatment. This resulted in a policy of treating couples simultaneously in separate rooms. He recovered before his wife, as she had been administered Ibogaine 24 hours after his treatment. He complained that he was getting bed sores and was no longer able to stay in bed. He asked for permission to go for a bicycle ride. Upon his leaving, his wife broke down and cried in the arms of a female paraclinician, stating she did not know if she could remain with her husband, but she was afraid he would die if she left him. This was a concept he continuously stressed to her during their treatment. After treatment, he followed a pattern of controlling his wife's contacts with other persons, including the treatment team, which was denied access to either of them. We later learned that they both returned to heroin use. However, 3 months later, the wife determined that her husband was incapable of loving himself or her, and that this was not the life she wished. She stopped using heroin, enrolled in nursing school, filed divorce proceedings against her husband, and is now specializing in psychiatric nursing. While initially she did not recognize that her decision to stop using heroin was due to her Ibogaine treatment, as the months went by, she realized that her determination to change her life was catalyzed by her experience with Ibogaine. Example 2. A cocaine-based dependent patient was treated and experienced an acute interruption of his drug use. During his Ibogaine treatment, he had a strong impression that if he continued to use drugs, God would punish him. He remained drug-free for about 30 days, after which he increased his drug use over the following months, and was retreated. The dose he received proved to be inadequate due to his vomiting the oral dose and to a bowel movement immediately following the rectal administration of Ibogaine, which he requested to remedy the loss of his oral dose. His drug use continued, but far below his original pre-treatment levels. About 6 months after his retreatment, the first Ibogaine therapy group, sponsored by the International Coalition for Addict Self-Help, directed by psychotherapist Barbara Judd, was established in New York. The patient attended these sessions until 15 months after his original treatment, when he recognized that he had to move away from his drug-infested neighborhood, whereupon he moved to Florida. In Florida, he has remained drug-free even though he had access to cocaine. He is employed in the construction industry by a business with strict non-drug use guidelines that is owned and run by former drug users. Example 3. One of the most important concepts learned by a person treated with Ibogaine is the addiction can be reversed. Persons dependent on drugs such as opiates or cocaine are not able to recognize that chemical dependence is a reversible phenomenon. This third example is of the only chemically dependent person from 1962 to 63 studied to receive a series of treatments at therapeutic levels with Ibogaine. The individual remained free of addiction for approximately 3.5 years as a result of his treatments. During that time, he moved to California, married, and worked in pharmaceutical sales. He later lost his job and when offered a ride back to New York, accepted it and returned to his life of minor drug dealing and use that resulted in his arrest and imprisonment. After his release, he worked for a while as a machinist, then slowly fell back into heroin use and addiction in 1969. Luckily, this was a period when the methadone programs were expanding, and he was able to enter one with one of the better programs run by Beth Israel Hospital. At that time, the programs were well-staffed with doctors, nurses, and adequate counselors, and the patient reached a point in his life when he recognized that the life of a heroin addict was not what he wanted. It was not just the heroin, but the scene itself, wherein a human life was without value, where sometimes a human being would be murdered for 2 cents worth of innocuous powder in the glassine envelope. The patient was ready to quit heroin, but was a slave to the cravings to use opiates for the relief they provided. Over a period of more than 2 years, the patient stabilized himself on methadone. He tried heroin once, 2 weeks after starting the methadone, was satisfied with the level of blockage that methadone offered, and never used heroin again. During the next few years, the methadone programs changed. Many of the competent counselors were unable to continue their positions due to the stress and sense of frustrations in their work, a condition common in the treatment community. The federal government placed more and more restrictions on methadone patients' freedoms of movement, and though methadone is anticipated to maintain the methadone client for a period of 24 hours, in many cases it does not. For this patient, withdrawal signs were setting in at 18 hours, not 24. The patient began a slow detoxification process of 100 milligrams of methadone per day that took approximately 18 months. The final stage of detoxification was followed by the patient's entry into a university-level training after he obtained a scholarship to a prominent university. At the end of the detoxification, the philosophy among methadone patients was that you could not get off methadone. But having previously had the Ibogaine experience, the patient stated that he knew addiction was reversible, and that knowledge allowed him to successfully leave addiction behind. Those are three very clear examples of how people in your life can be of a detriment when you're trying to quit drugs, how they can eventually be an influence to trigger you back into addiction, how the setting that you're living in, your environment, can also be a detriment to your rehabilitation. If it's always around you and you're not able to get away from it, then the temptation is always there, and that's a real hard hurdle to get over. And the third example, of course, being that the patient knew that he could quit the addiction by the dose of Ibogaine that he had. It helped him with the mindset that this was an addiction that he could reverse, that this was a cycle that he could break, and armed with that information, he was able to make the decisions later on in life that led to him getting clean. This next article that I'm going to read is actually a self-report, and it's important because it was done by someone who was a physician that was addicted to opiates. And the article is titled Current Treatments, a Self-Report, and this is on ibogaine.desk.nl. Personal Communication, 1994. The following report is from the type of patient we had been seeking for years, a medical doctor who had been treated with Ibogaine. The subject was chemically dependent on 600 milligrams of Demerol a day and had attempted to stop his drug use a number of times without any lasting success. Our particular interest in this subject was the hope that, as a medical doctor, he might provide us with some professional insight into the results of his treatment. He kept notes and provided a report on the 4 different doses he received, which is presented in its entirety. This subject proved to be more sensitive to Ibogaine than any other individual in our studies conducted outside the United States, and had a full-blown experience from a 10 milligram per kilogram of body weight dose. The patient had participated in a research protocol that called for an intermediate dose of 10 milligrams per kilogram of Ibogaine, which was administered as part of a pharmacokinetic study and was not expected to have therapeutic effects, but it did. As part of the protocol, patients would then be administered a known therapeutic dose of 20 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. First day, 100 milligrams, test dose number 1. I've taken my Ibogaine dose and went to bed. I stayed laying down. I felt nothing until the medical staff arrived to do the first 1 hour test. I was surprised because in my mental measurements, I thought I had taken the Ibogaine about 20 minutes earlier. When I stood up, I felt a little drowsy, and it was difficult to walk in a straight line. I was feeling photophobia, and every little noise seemed to be much louder than in reality. The sounds were very disturbing to me. During the 2-hour testing, symptoms were worse. It was very difficult to walk in a straight line, and the room seemed to beat like a heart. I felt very tired, and the only thing I wanted was to rest in my bed. Each head movement seemed to make things worse. When I stood up for the 3-hour test, I felt that the symptoms were disappearing. I was very hungry and ate. After eating, I was a little nauseated. For the following hours, I felt nothing, except for sensation that my mind images were richer in detail than before, like a 3D movie. I ate with no nausea, slept very well, and awakened in very good condition. Second day, 25 milligram, test dose number 2. After this dose of Ibogaine, I felt nothing different from my normal state. Third day, 10 milligrams per kilogram, experimental dose. For the first 2 hours, I felt a little different, like I had smoked marijuana. I was very calm and relaxed, and all the tension of the beginning of the procedure was gone. The room seemed to be a little different, and the colors around me sharper than normal. The lights and sounds were disturbing to me, like the first time. Suddenly, with my eyes closed, I began to see images that appeared in screens, exactly like TV or cinema screens. These screens were appearing in small sizes, and then they would get bigger as I focused my attention on them. Sometimes they appeared small and then would begin to grow like I was walking in their direction, and sometimes they were going from left to right in a continuous way. The images on the screen were moving in slow motion and were very sharp and well defined. I saw trees moving with the wind, a man with bells in his hands, various landscapes with mountains and sunsets. At this time, I was a little nauseated, and when the doctors asked me to stand up for some tests, I vomited. From all the hundreds of images I saw this day, I recognized only 2. The first, an image of myself as a child, static like a photo. This image began to approach me and get bigger, but something in the room happened, and I opened my eyes, losing the image. The second image I recognized was one of some horses dancing in a circus. It was a TV show that I had seen 2 days earlier. The time seemed to go very quickly because after about 4 hours in my mind, they told me I had taken Ibogaine 9 hours earlier. It was very difficult for me to speak in English or in Spanish. I was only able to speak in my native language. At this time, the images started to appear at a slower rate, and for another 2 hours I saw only screens with no images on them. About 10 to 11 hours after I had begun the experiment, they disappeared. I ate very well and stayed awake all night long, falling asleep only about 7 a.m., almost 24 hours after the medication had been administered. During the night, I had some insights about my life and about the things I realized I was doing wrong. I stayed all the following day very tired, sleepy, but very happy and relaxed in a way I never was before. Fifth day, 20 milligrams per kilogram therapeutic dose. The first 3 hours were very similar to the last time, photophobia and a bad sensation with little noises. After that, the images began to appear in a slower rate than the other time. There were less images, but I was recognizing all of them as part of my childhood. I saw myself playing in my father's farm, riding a motorcycle, playing with a cousin, feeding a fish, and other things. I saw some recent images, like one of my father laughing in the living room of my house. This happened about a year ago. I understood that I had a happy childhood and that there was no one to blame for my addiction, only myself. I felt the love coming from my parents and relatives. I was feeling the same time. I was feeling the same time distortions that I felt the other day, and after many hours, I suddenly had an insight. It was that my mind and the universe were the same thing, and that all people in the universe and all things in the universe are only one. I saw many mistakes I was doing in my life, so many attitudes I could not have, and this helped me to decide very strongly that I will never use Demerol again. Now I can see very clearly that I don't need Demerol to live my life, and I feel better if I don't use it. During the first 8 hours of taking the Ibogaine, I vomited 4 or 5 times, always after I tried to move. I was able to sleep at about 4 a.m. and to eat only at 9 a.m. the following day. I awakened feeling weak, tired, and drowsy. As the hours were going, I slept a lot and began feeling better, and in the morning of the following day, I was normal. Differences in day-to-day life after the experience. I returned to my normal life with absolutely no cravings, with better appetite than before, and highly self-confident. Now I can see the differences in some aspects of my personality. Things are changed. For example, I used to avoid driving at night because it reminded me of a car accident I had years ago. Now I can drive any time, day or night, without anxiety. I'm sure that this is caused by Ibogaine because now I'm not the same very anxious person I was. I'm not as shy as I used to be also. It's easier now to contradict people when I think they are wrong and to make them know what I want and what I think. I used to accept all that other people said only to avoid a discussion, even when I was sure that my point of view was the correct one. These are the main happenings in my Ibogaine experience and the main differences I can perceive in these few days. Some months later. The most important thing I learned with all that happened is that I can never underestimate the power of an addictive personality I have inside. I can never say I'm cured because if I do this, I will forget to protect myself from drug-using thoughts. I must know I have a chronic disease that will be quiet in its place until I decide to give it a chance to grow. This decision, and that's the point, is a conscious decision. If I give in, the disease will be out of control in a few days, but if I could be strong to take a real and honest control of my Demerol-using thoughts, I will be free forever. A few days ago, because of professional needs, I had to keep 2 Demerol doses with me in my house all night long. To protect myself, I gave them to my wife, but it was amazing to see how I was not anxious to use them, but to give them to the patients that needed them. I clearly felt that Demerol was a strange thing in my environment. I wasn't curious about the place my wife had put them. I wasn't feeling any craving. I was only looking forward to the moment I could give them to the patient and say, I've done it. And I did it because of all of your work at the NDA. I don't want to be boring, but I have no words to say how grateful we, my family, and I are. I will remember you for a lifetime. And that's the end of the personal communication. Now that's a pretty detailed analysis of that person's experience. And of course, they were a medical doctor, so they've got some experience in reporting those happenings to people and keeping track of it. So I think it's obvious from the information that we've taken a look at today that Ibogaine is a valuable treatment for drug addiction, and not only in the sense of its immediacy with the addiction interruption and the withdrawal symptoms being alleviated, but it also has certain aspects of the psychological, psychedelic aspect that in the first phase it shows different movies and like a 3D awakening dreaming phase that shows people different decisions that they made throughout their life and different scenes of their past and their childhood, and then the secondary phase of the intellectual evaluation of what that information meant and being able to make decisions that will change their behavior and hopefully help them avoid regressing into continuing to use drugs. And of course, it's also of the three examples, we saw how the situation with another person in their life who was continuing to be a drug addict, who had obvious emotional or mental illnesses that were preventing them from seeing the same benefits from the treatment, as well as someone who was able to change their environment because the drugs were available in their environment, and it was also a temptation and a trigger and would lead to continued drug use. And the third example, which gave the patient the mental tools to understand that addiction is reversible, that he was able to, through his use of Ibogaine, see that he was able to stop the addiction in its tracks. And when he got into a situation where he was addicted again and then eventually sought treatment through methadone, and the dominant culture at that time amongst the methadone users were that there is no cure for the methadone, that it's impossible to get off of. And of course, from his Ibogaine use, he knew that that wasn't true, and he used those tools to quit the addiction and move on with his life. And he also got involved with people who were recovering drug addicts, so he had some long-term support and a strong network that understood what he was going through. Now, as we count these benefits, it would seem obvious to a thinking person that this would, if someone chooses to take this path of treatment, that it should be available to them. But unfortunately, it's still illegal. It's Schedule I in the United States, which means it's got absolutely no medical benefit whatsoever. And we've also mentioned that there are some dangers involved with it, and 1 out of every 300 people that take this medication could possibly be fatal for them. But given the circumstances that someone's life can get to, faced with a heavy heroin addiction or cocaine addiction or methamphetamine addiction, if they've tried everything else and they're in the state of mind that they may not be helpable, that they may not be fixable, that they may not be able to get out of this cycle, then in their situation, the risk might be worth it. But it being illegal, of course, it's not. They'd have to travel out of country to take advantage of it. Some of the methods that are legal and being researched and developed in the United States primarily deal with blocking the effects of a drug. For instance, there are medications that will block the effects of taking opiates. There are drugs that they're developing that will block the effects of cocaine when you take them. However, that does not have the same psychedelic effect of giving you a life review and an intellectual an opportunity to intellectually go over that information and see where you made bad decisions. This is just straight up and down. You take cocaine, it won't have an effect on you. Now, while that's certainly helpful in its own way, there are some drawbacks to this technique. For instance, researching the opioid blocking medication, I find that the pills themselves, which are to be taken 3 times a day, the dosages can be up to $10 per pill, so you're spending $30 a day, and that's 30 days a month, and that can get expensive, and I'm not sure if insurance would cover that. And that's in stark contrast to a single dose of Ibogaine, or possibly 2 or 3 throughout your life for maintenance purposes, that have very strong physiological and psychological effects to help you beat the addiction. And again, to keep in mind that this should be coupled with a very strong, very active psychological treatment. Long-term support groups should be sought out. That's effectively something that should be focused on very much by someone who's hoping to kick a drug addiction, because really all the Ibogaine can do physiologically is to stop the withdrawal symptoms and to provide the psychedelic experience with the life review and the intellectual review of that information afterwards. So I appreciate your time. I thank you very much for listening. This is Liberty. I suggest checking out a website, lunaticoutpost.com. This is Lop Radio, and we will talk at you later.